Welcome, everyone, to the Burn-In Book event. Today, we've got a really awesome event that we're going to be holding and running. If you're watching the stream, if you're watching this at home, you're probably familiar with Pete Singer and August Cole, authors of the book Burn-In and their prior book, Ghost Fleet. Today, we have something I'm really excited about. We've got, they're going to talk a little bit about the book and then go to a panel of experts, Rob Lee, Liz Wharton, and John Costello. And I'll do a little bit of introduction for them in just a minute when we get ready to kick off the panel portion. But the book itself is really interesting. It's really good. I had the chance to binge listen to it on Audible over the weekend. And I was really impressed by the foresight that they had as somebody who comes from the cybersecurity community, information security community. How they got a lot of the details right that a lot of kind of future writing doesn't really take the time to get all the way right. So I know that they put a lot of work into it, and hopefully you find that they did. They're going to talk a little bit about how they do that, how they try and tell those stories that are technically literate, and then some of the panelists will weigh in with some of their thoughts. But before we get into that, I want to introduce Congressman Jim Langevin. Congressman Langevin and I have known each other for several years now. He's come out to DEF CON a couple of times, the world's biggest hacking conference. And he's been really a champion for security researchers and for greater cybersecurity in federal agencies as well as across the United States. So I'm really eager and happy to have him here. Representative Langevin, it's all yours.
Great. Well, good afternoon, Bo. Thank you for the introduction, and thrilled to be with everybody today. I know you're in for a fascinating discussion about this new book and the whole concept that it conveys. I think it's appropriate that we're having this discussion virtually, as a matter of fact. What better way to do it? But Bo, thank you for inviting me to participate today. You've been a wonderful guide for me the couple of times that I've been to DEF CON, and you certainly are a brilliant ambassador for the cybersecurity research community. And I'd like to think that you and I together helped to forge a great line of communication between policymakers and the cybersecurity research communities. So great to be teaming up with you once again. Let me start with a bit of a disclosure to the fact that I fully admit to being completely unable to be objective when it comes to the work of Peter Singer and August Cole. I'm a fan of their work. Three of my passions that I'm known for in Congress are cybersecurity, directed energy, so next generation laser weapons, and the railgun. And on the railgun in particular, in efforts to either kill or mothball, or the momentum wasn't there for railgun, I was able to resurrect and continue to push hard for get the funding where it needed to go. And so when one of my staffers told me about Ghost Fleet, and yes, a spoiler alert, that a key plot point involved the use of a mothball, maybe railgun, after a massive cyber attack. I thought my office maybe had been bugged, or I had some special insight into what I was thinking and doing. In fact, I actually have a railgun slug sitting on my desk from when I went out to Dahlgren military base to actually see the railgun in person. So anyway, great book, and I devoured the book, I have to say. And I'll always say that after years of feeling like a voice in the wilderness, both on cyber and the railgun, I started getting queries from colleagues now about the book after they had finished reading it. My colleagues had finished reading it themselves, and other people have become aware of it. So anyway, great book, and fan of their work. So I currently serve on both the House Armed Services Committee and the Homeland Security. I did 8 years It's the limit on the House Intelligence Committee. And from those committees, I have to say I've observed one really consistent element that continued plagues U.S. policymakers and professionals and voters that any people in the executive branch is really this lack of imagination. It's the big policymakers in the executive branch would have a lot of these things figured out ahead of time, but we as policymakers, as professionals, and voters, really are surprised by events that we didn't expect because they are just so different from the mundane or the routine monotony of the daily grind. So, Mr. Singer and Mr. Cole really suffer no such deficiency of imagination, and so rather just to the contrary, their ability to really envision scenarios that could arise from existing trends help us really to reframe how we think about the seemingly mundane threats that are around us. So the report, I was very proud and honored to be a part of the Solarium Commission. And in our introduction to our final report, they were great in painting a scenario in the front of a massive cyber attack. The report kicks off with a fictional scenario of Capitol Hill, and just how much destruction can occur even when the weapons they're using are bits or bytes of code. And I have to give a lot of credit to my colleague on the commission and Senator Angus King, who really insisted that we paint that kind of a scenario to capture the public's attention, the average reader's attention of what could happen in the worst case scenario of a cyber attack being carried out against our country. So it was incredibly helpful. I've heard on the report has really proved him just really prescient, and by putting things in terms of people that can understand this, or they really do convey to the public just how high the stakes are in cyberspace. So I just want to give my heartfelt thanks for adding to the Solarium report and helping us convey the importance of our strategy and our recommendations. I can't wait to see what you've done in the newest endeavor in Burn-In, and I say this tongue in cheek, but I'm only half convinced that we're maybe only a few years away from Skynet becoming self-aware, and we're all battling the robots that are built by machines. So anyway, I look forward to the discussion today. Look forward to reading the book Burn-In. Have fun with the discussion today, and enjoy. Again, thanks both to Peter and August, and Bo, thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman Langevin. Very much appreciate those words. All right, now we're going to move over to a discussion with the book authors, as well as a discussion with some of our panelists today. So today with us, I'll introduce the panelists really quickly, and I'll give Pete and August a chance to introduce themselves. So Robert Lee is CEO and founder of Dragos Security. They work in the industrial control space. Robert, before he joined the private sector, was with the military and with some other groups working on industrial control systems security. So he knows the space really well. And whenever something bad happens, he's always the first call that the infrastructure providers make, as well as the media. So very well versed in this field. Liz Wharton works with a company called Scythe. She also helps and volunteers with the ICS Village at DEF CON. Before she joined those two teams, she was spent some of her time with the city of Atlanta working at Hartsfield Airport. Knows drones very well, knows aerospace and aviation security very well, and knows how cities react when potential cyber attacks or cyber threats pop up on the horizon. And finally, John Costello is with the U.S. Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which just issued a report from their working groups and their efforts, and is continuing to update it. They just released the addendum, which is around the COVID-19 and some lessons learned in the past few months since their initial publication in November, December last year. Before that, John did a lot of work in intelligence analysis, and was with DHS as a senior advisor. So without further ado, Pete and August, I'm going to turn it over to you to lead us the rest of the way.
Well, Bo, thank you for convening everyone here together. To the guests, to Congressman Langevin, thank you again for carving out your Friday to talk about what we think are some of the most important issues that are at this intersection of technology, politics, society. And in this book that Pete and I have just come out with, Burn In, a novel of the real robotic revolution, we're trying to have a conversation that can help people understand the next decade and what lies ahead in terms of the everyday autonomy around artificial intelligence and robotics that's going to have profound implications. Of course, there's going to be great convenience. There's going to be incredible economic opportunity. But with that, there's also going to be real questions about who benefits and when from these sorts of advances. And of course, we know that every time we connect something to the internet, we also incur vulnerability. And it's on this last point too that our guests today are so able to speak to these really critical questions that are both technical, but also really questions for all of society as we value what sort of convenience versus safety that will be a part of our America of the 2030s. Burn In, a little bit about the book. I'll talk briefly, then turn it over to Pete for a couple of minutes, and then we'll open up a larger conversation with the panelists. But Burn In follows an FBI counterterrorism agent and a robot partner that she's been assigned to work with. And the world that they live in will be familiar. It's set in Washington, D.C. So for those of you who are inside the Beltway, you're going to find that some of it is going to be eerily familiar. There will, of course, still be very bad traffic, yet there will be also fairly large shifts underway. And some of them will be quite profound. Others will be less visible. You know, the way that artificial intelligence and everyday autonomy and robotics are going to transform how we work, how we act politically, what we value in terms of our own place in society is going to be up in the air, creating a sort of a intersection that will be at times feeling like it evokes the Industrial Revolution's most tumultuous days, or even the cultural chaos of the 60s. And this is something that, you know, fiction can do really well. You know, when we talk about the sort of useful fiction that you could put Ghost Fleet into that basket, Burn In as well, we're trying also to use these sorts of stories to have conversations that allow people to enjoy something over the weekend, because if you can't finish a book, it's not any use to you. And then to be able to go into work though the next day and actually have a more fulsome conversation, whether it's about data privacy, facial surveillance, facial recognition technology, I mean, whether it's about what roles should be automated and what roles should not in society. And this idea that you can wrap this in a techno thriller that's fact-based, I think, is still somewhat novel and new, but important as part of this larger movement that helps us, fortunately, I think, get closer to avoiding the failure of imagination around really big risks. I'll turn it over to Pete for a couple minutes, and then we'll move to our panelists and get into the Q&A.
Well, first, I want to begin also with a thanks to Bo and the organizers and all of you for joining us, and also to the Congressman for his incredibly kind words. We really do appreciate that. And it makes the type of endeavor that we're on, as August mentioned, of doing useful fiction, or sometimes we call it ficant, in terms of, you know, the parallel to signals intelligence, SIGINT, or OSINT, open source. Ficant is the idea of using the combination of research and narrative to explain, project, conduct analysis. And it's very much, you know, Burn In is both a story, as was referenced. It's also an experiment to see the utility of this kind of approach. So it's great to hear that kind of feedback on it, and also just all of you joining. As August mentioned, Burn In is a new kind of book. It's a combination of novel and nonfiction. So you have this story that follows an FBI agent through Washington, D.C. about 10, 15 years out. And you get to go to all of these different places that are familiar, you know, Union Station, the Smithsonian Mall, Starbucks, even a condo in Ballston. But along the way, you also follow her hunt for a new kind of terrorist, and a terrorist who, relevant to what gathers is here, who is using the vulnerabilities that we're baking in particular to the Internet of Things, to carry out new kinds of attacks that weren't possible in the past, but will be possible moving forward. And yet that story, throughout it, you pull roughly 300 explanations and predictions of everything from how does AI work to how will drones be utilized in deliveries to what are vulnerabilities being baked into our water treatment system. And so it has those, but it also has 27 pages of research and notes to document, hey, that's not just what these guys dreamed up. Here's actually the real world sourcing for it. And relevant to a lot of people in this space, that research range from, threat reports to people demoing something at, looking at Bo's background, demoing something that was possible at DEF CON, and then saying, hey, what if this is actually deployed in the real world? It's made for a pretty uncanny experience the last couple of weeks. I don't want to plot spoil too much, but one of the types of attacks that we have in the book just hit Israeli water treatment systems. And if anyone believes that the small towns' water treatment systems on the upper Potomac River have better cybersecurity than the Israeli government, I have really, really bad news for you. But more broadly, what it points to, again, is I think it's not just the types of attacks. It leads to a whole new need of thinking around internet security in terms of now how the consequences move from being primarily about the theft of information to more and more kinetic style damage. And it might be going after an individual, a new kind of crime going into a smart home, or it might be about going after an entire community. And we use the story to carry across that research. So that's a little bit about the project. And again, it's just exciting to be able to share it with all of you.
Thanks a lot, Pete. For the next 20 minutes or so, we'll have 25 minutes. We'll have the panelists kind of going back and forth and having what I hope is a fairly loose discussion, infused with this sort of spirit of experimentation and narrative as well. That is very much part of this Ficant approach. I'm going to kick off this phase of the event with a reading. It won't be a reading from Vernon, but it's a reading from the Solarium Commission report, and it's in fact that narrative that Pete and I worked on, which it helps frame, I think, the stakes for a reader. One of the big challenges, particularly when you're dealing with technologies that have ways of working that you can't see, but implications and effects that are in fact in the real world, it's very difficult to help connect people to those kinds of problems, to those kinds of, importantly, solutions. And so I'm going to start by reading just a little bit of a warning from tomorrow, the essay that precedes the Solarium Commission report. You spend your whole career on Capitol Hill hoping for an office with a window, and then you finally get it, and all you want to do is look away. They set up our emergency offsite for essential Senate staff in vacant offices once belonging to one of the contractors that lobbied us before they went belly up last year. The offices are in a high-rise in Roslyn with a literal $1 million view. Looking across the Potomac River, you can see past the National Mall and the monuments all the way into downtown DC. And it just breaks your heart. The rainbow of colors in the window paints how everything went so wrong so fast. The water in the Potomac still has that red tint from when the treatment plants upstream were hacked, their automated systems tricked into flushing out the wrong mix of chemicals. By comparison, the water in the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool has a purple glint to it. They pumped out the floodwaters that covered Washington's low-lying areas after the region's reservoirs were hit in a cascade of sensor hacks, but the surge left behind an oily sludge that will linger for who knows how long. That's what you get from deciding in the 18th century to put your capital city in a low-lying swampland, and then in the 21st century, wiring up all its infrastructure to an insecure network. All around the mall, you can see the black smudges of the delivery drones and air taxis that were remotely hijacked to crash into crowds of innocents like fiery meteors. And in the open spaces and parks beyond, tiny dots of bright colors smear together like some kind of tragic, pointless painting. These are the camping tents and makeshift shelters of the refugees who fled the toxic railroad accident caused by the control system failure in Baltimore. FEMA says it's safe to go back now that the chemical cloud is dissipated. But with all the churn and disinfo on social media, no one knows who or what to trust. Last night, the orange of their campfires was like a vigil of the obstinate, waiting for everything just to return to the way it was. But it won't. that fairly dark and dystopian view of the aftermath of the kind of calamity we envision and burn in is really important, I think, for snapping people's attention and capturing their imagination. And I want to turn first in the spirit of this sort of creative exercise to Liz Wharton, who has extensive experience with the real world challenges of infrastructure, but also who identified with one of the characters in our book because she too is a lawyer. Liz, I'll turn it over to you and have you talk a bit about some of the kind of creative exploration that you were using to think through the future of these kinds of cyber risks at this scale.
Well, thank you. And hopefully not completely automated just yet, but in a prior life, so to speak, I got to work with Department of Aviation and was a senior technology attorney for the world's busiest airport. And if anyone's ever flown through Hartsfield-Jackson, if something at Hartsfield catches a cold, the rest of the aviation industry gets the flu, so to speak. And so, yes, pun intended. With that, one of the jobs of the legal department was we would review and help respond to Freedom of Information or Open Records Act requests. So imagine, if you will, as an incident has occurred, the software program has gone and autonomously selected, using AI and algorithms, has selected a series of, let's say, text messages that were incoming to an individual within the Department of Aviation. And hypothetically, if there was a breach and there was an incident where a network went down, because that's never happened in the city of Atlanta, but what would some of those messages look like 10 years from now? That in a system where everything is getting flagged, you have autonomous baggage handling. You have robots, or we'll call them ambassadors, that are greeting and providing direction throughout the airport. What happens when those go offline? When you're ticketing, it depends on being able to connect to your Apple Watch or everything, the wristlets that are used in Burn-In Book. What happens with those? And so, incoming message. Have you seen the social media feed? Reports of lost luggage. Robotic baggage handlers must be taking a break. Incoming message. Hey, nice airport. I think y'all lost my luggage. Tracking is down. What kind of system is this? Incoming message. Shutting down the free Wi-Fi. Expect complaints. Alert. Incoming message. Drone airspace navigation system is reporting miscellaneous drones in the airspace. No visual confirmation, must ground all flights. What happens if these systems that we're relying upon get hacked themselves? What happens when, incoming message, network is down, facial recognition requires network, get me my ticketing now. Incoming message, no Wi-Fi, how does this airport expect me to access my ticket? My watch can't connect if there's no Wi-Fi. Incoming message, coffee maker and air traffic control is down. What's up with the network? Need caffeine. You think of all these different systems, and I'd like to think that, or, spoiler alert, all the airport or all the airlines are actually using the same vendors. There's one vendor. So, incoming message, can't calculate flight weight, must ground all airplanes. So when all of this is kind of going on, I would feel for the attorneys having to then scrub, because while colorful language is not the best look for an airport disclosing internal messages, you don't necessarily get to redact that one under the different things. I don't know how you would describe some of the emojis that I'm sure people would be sending, but thinking of all of those interconnected pieces, and as we've become more reliant on them, really gave me a headache and made me really glad that I'm with Scythe and no longer with an authority that would have to have some responsibility for that.
What I love about that example is it is emblematic of the different forms of this approach of ficant that can take you can use, or that they can take. not everybody has to, approaching things through, for example, a short story is one way, of course, but yet this creation of future artifacts, whether it's a GAO report from the 2020s on the railgun of the future, as Congressman Langevin said, or whether it's, in this case, the reams of FOIA paper and documents that would be produced in the aftermath of a calamity of the sort that was described. And I think what's important about that too is because you're able to use those artifacts to kind of translate your position from the world of 2020 today to being very much in the mindset and point of view of somebody who is wrestling with those very kind of technical but also critical questions to how we establish a narrative about how these things happen. Rob, I was going to turn to you and thinking also about this question of narrative and perspective. You obviously have a very, very close read of the ICS threat landscape right now, and also where it's going. So I have a two-pronged question perhaps that you could kind of respond to, which would be about how do you view that evolution of the landscape, and is it a kind of linear curve or is it like steeper? And secondly, how do you kind of stay creative in thinking about what those future threats look like?
Sure, great. So from a threat landscape perspective today, I think the era to which we're in is we're beginning to see some of the things that have existed for quite some time. So we've traditionally had a visibility gap into what are happening in these industrial networks. Some very mature companies, companies that are world leaders, but immature in their ICS security programs, just so they can't get a handle on what are we or what we're not seeing. I usually joke around that we essentially have Schrodinger's ICS all over the place, where we just don't look in the box to sort of see what's going on, but we're starting to do that. And so there's a lot of infrastructure companies around the world, especially here in the United States, that are actually doing a lot more than people realize, and they're starting to be much more proactive, and they don't come out and take credit for a lot of the security work they're doing, but they're doing quite a bit of it. And so they're starting to learn more things. And so we're starting to see more threats. I would say 5 years ago to talk about 12 different state actors targeting ICS specifically would be very, very abnormal. Today, that's absolutely run of the mill. But we're going to see that, to your question about that exponential growth or not, we're going to see it get much worse looking. The question is, how much is that the reality of the threats getting worse, or how much of that is just us getting the visibility? To some level, our understanding of the threats is almost a maturity curve that as we get better, we're starting to see just how bad the problem is. And this leads into your second question, what we have been seeing and what we've been noticing is threats are most certainly learning from each other, just like they have in all the other industries to date, where the state actor kind of tradecraft becomes criminal tradecraft. You start to see this ability for others to access it. And we're starting to see states that had really unique capabilities teach other states just by their operations getting exposed. The Trisis attack in a petrochemical facility back in 2017 in Saudi Arabia was the first time ever that a threat that we know of explicitly targeted human life. And they tried to kill folks at that site by compromising a safety system. But now that's a blueprint for anybody to go after a safety system. It's not about vulnerabilities of a system. It's about a style of attack, especially when you talk about industrial automation and the systems challenge. But in that second sort of where are we going question, and this actually goes very well with what Elizabeth stated as well, in terms of like, hey, there's that one vendor across the airports. Well, our world is most certainly going through digital transformation. I think it tends to be a buzzword for some audiences, but it's happening. We're starting to have cloud-connected sensors in industrial automation environments, and we're starting to have much more autonomy. So that's not a 2030s thing. That's now. And the problem for a lot of companies is they don't realize it. The world has been changing around them, even in their own environments and networks, and they may not have been seeing it. They may not realize just how hyper-connected they are now. I would hope, and hopefully it's in your book, that by the 2030s, we've killed the rumor of the air gap, but maybe it'll still exist then too. But these things are connected. And what I'm worried about, where I think we're going, is more homogenous infrastructure and more homogenous sort of capabilities across the infrastructure community for common operating platforms and open DCS standards and similar. And what that'll relate to is that the attacks that used to be very specific, developing an attack on a petrochemical facility against the safety system, that is handcrafted, tailor-made, APT to table, that is just for that one site. But as you go more homogenous, you start having scalability with that. You start to be able to have one attack be able to be transplanted at other petrochemical sites. And more importantly, you start to have criminal actors pick up on it. So to tie it all together and pass it over back to you, what I'm terrified of is the world to which we're preparing for now is of state actors. And we kind of easily handle the idea around motivations and political barriers and things around that. But as our industry is changing and as our threats are getting more aggressive, we are going to have a turning point to where we start dealing much more with criminal actors across a wide variety of intents. And we don't get a tech refresh in industrial networks, every 3 to 5 years. You got to plan for that 5-10 years in advance. And on the trajectory we're on right now, there's a flipping point that gets real bad real quickly, and it's hard to recover from
that. As a quick follow-up question, when do you see that flipping point taking place?
I think it will be different by industry and region. A good example of that is when we saw the Ukraine 2015 attack took place, the first cyber attack on electric power systems. They were able to recover faster than we would have recovered here because they went to automation later in their journey, and they still had people in the workforce that knew how to go back. So the U.S. grid is not, well, U.S. grid, there's more than one grid, but U.S. electric system is not equivalent of the Ukraine electric system. But to give you this short answer, for some industries, it's within a 5-year period. For some, it might be longer. And there are definitely companies that it's a day thing. There are plenty of fully automated industrial environments that are very common, cookie cutter. Certain, I won't go into specific industries, certain environments you can find that a 10.10.10.15 IP address is the HMI in every single one of these, same vendor, same communication standards. The only thing different right now is the physical process. And luckily, that's the case. Because a lot of what industrial control systems are is all the same stuff you have in IT plus physics. And right now that physics piece is saving us, but there'll be a point in time where that physics piece is exactly what we're worried about.
That's excellent. John, talk to me a bit about your view of how the sorts of narratives, the stories we tell ourselves about cybersecurity affect the actual implementation of policy. My first interaction with you, if you recall, was around science fiction. A number of years ago, and that's a great way to get to know somebody through their sci-fi writing, I think. But and the friendship that's developed since, I think, is a testament to that. But this question though of narrative, I think, is really important in the stories we tell about cybersecurity. And how do you see us closing that narrative to reality gap in the 2020s as the threat landscape changes, as Rob said?
August, that's a good question. Look, not every member of Congress is like Representative Langevin, who is well steeped in the issue, who understands a lot of the technical terms that you're talking about, who understands a lot of the dynamics, has an intuitive understanding, and just years of knowing about this, knowing about the issue. It's not a coincidence that narrative and stories are the most effective currency for understanding, most effective and compelling currency for understanding for humans. I can give you an hour-long lecture on public policy, or I can tell you a 5-minute story, and I can guarantee you one's going to be far more effective and illustrative than the other, and making you understand why there is a problem and why we need to solve it and what we can do to solve it. I know when we're interacting with the commission, when we're interacting with committees on the Hill, narrative is a portable way and a very time-intensive, not time-intensive, but a time-efficient way to try to illustrate to them. I mean, what we've done is that is part of the reason why the commissioners were insistent that we asked you and Peter to write a narrative to try to illustrate where we see the United States headed if we don't solve this problem, if we don't implement some of the ideas and recommendations we had in the report. And it was, we asked it to be from the perspective of a staffer for a reason. We wanted that's what we wanted the audience to be. We wanted it to be from someone from the view from the Hill. As far as implementation, narrative can also sort of demonstrate the intent of a recommendation. I mean, when you're writing something that can be arcane and I think is inaccessible as a piece of legislation or a public policy analysis, some things get lost in the shuffle. You're focused on the details, little quibbling here, like name of agencies and report timelines and all this and all that. And sometimes you lose the forest because you're so focused on the trees. Marrying up a recommendation or a piece of legislation with a narrative or a background or a narrative gives a much clearer intent on what we're trying to achieve, the type of scenario you're looking to avoid. I just think it's an incredible public policy tool, and I think you and Peter have been harbingers of a new tool in public policy making, in my mind. And I've seen it change in the military. I've seen it change on the Hill of a shift of telling stories and crafting a narrative, speculative or not. I mean, for every 10 speculative stories that are compelling and scary, there's usually one or two real world examples that you can draw up and demonstrate as well. So, I mean, I'd say from the Commission's perspective, from my perspective, that's how we use them, and that's their importance.
That's great, John. You know, Pete, do you want to talk a little bit about how we identified the threats that we chose to highlight in Burn-In? Because whether it's flying cars falling from the sky, as we talked about in the book, to these really core safety-oriented infrastructure vulnerability questions, unpack a little bit, maybe the process.
Sure. You know, so it's interesting. Again, the idea of it is not just the narrative, but that it's sharing nonfiction research, and that's what keeps it from being just, you know, pure science fiction. It also keeps it from being, you know, some of you know, I also work on a project on trying to raise the level of how Hollywood is portraying cybersecurity, and it hopefully keeps it from being the story that, you know, you often see in TV or movies of, like, you know, clickety clack, we're in, you know, that it's like, no, you need to ground it in real world examples, which also means you're going after real world vulnerabilities and the like. So in terms of this twin mastering, we were simultaneously building out story, scenes, character, fleshing that out, but we're also doing real world research, and research that, you know, we can document of both the type of either it's attacks that have already happened or just barely been averted, a report on that. And, you know, I'm looking at Rob Lee, and he's been at the center of several of these. And you know, those have been inspirational of, here's how someone goes after XYZ. And even the mention that he made of the attack going after the safety systems and, you know, targeting life. So you're doing it either from attacks that have actually happened. Okay, what happens as Stuxnet moves from being something that was highly tailored to, as we see this sort of, you know, lowering the barriers to entry of going after kinetic systems. The second is from threat reports and tests to show the art of the possible, which is, you know, so much that we talk about in this field. And what we think we're also doing is sharing, hey, there is this vulnerability. You ought to do something about it if you don't act. And that's much of what we are doing is, you know, hey, someone showed off they could do X. Someone showed off that you could affect the read of a driverless car or a unmanned system to cause it to believe that it is physically located other than the geographic location that it believes it's in. And then that allows you to do things like crash it. And so it's sharing that. And then the third type of research is what people talk about, and, you know, over beers, and everyone on this panel has kind of done that of like, man, you know, and one for us was someone who had worked on the water systems of DC, and basically talked through the compromises that they had been made for budget savings and convenience, but that it opened up some amazing vulnerabilities to potentially recreate parts of the 1936 flood. And what was great about that conversation is in the middle of it, he's revealing, you know, exactly, there's a handful of valves that are being digitized that if you flip them, it would allow this flooding to happen. And his wife in the background yells out, "Don't tell him which valves. You don't know him all that well." And so, you know, we don't share which valves, but we do share, hey, you know, what we've done is undermine some of the age-old defenses that are out there to allow old scenarios to come to pass. And so again, in other cases, it might be something that didn't happen deliberately, but happened accidentally. And then we go, ooh, could someone then try and recreate that? So an example, going back to what John was saying, and you don't want to plot spoil too much, but to put it bluntly, we show how someone could recreate the 10 biblical plagues through cyber means. One of them was the river turns a certain color. That was an inspiration from what happened in Russia, where Google blood red Russian river, and you'll see imagery of what happened when there was a chemical spill that accidentally happened to change the color of a river. We play with, okay, that accident, what if someone did it, again, deliberately? And then the final part of this that I think connects to all of our work is in trying to make it realistic, we also, much like an attacker, go after the, not the hardest targets, but the lowest targets. So it's become, there are certain parts of critical infrastructure that are well defended because of everything from greater legislative attention paid to them to the structure of their marketplace in terms of there's well-funded companies. And then there's other parts of critical infrastructure that are not well defended because of both, there's not as much legislative attention that's been paid to it, but also their marketplace is made up of, mom and pop size companies or small town government authorities, or the government agencies that's in charge of regulating them is not all that interested in cybersecurity the way, for example, the finance industry is. And so we also kind of play with that of, if we're going to choose scenarios, let's go after that. And then finally, going back to the very first goal of fiction, you want to tell a different story. So again, I'll plot spoil. It's not the repeated, the power grid might get hacked and go down. It's, let's look at these other parts of critical infrastructure that are out there that we equally need to pay attention to, because guess what? Threat actors are too. And it makes a more interesting story than the umpteen different movies and novels where the power grid goes completely down across the United States.
Definitely don't want failure of imagination on the part of the writers either, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, Bo, if the queue of questions is filling up, we can turn to the audience. If not, I'm happy to steer a few towards the panelists.
Yeah, sure. We've got a handful of questions. So let me read out a couple of these, and then if you guys want to keep going, expand on these, we can. So we had a couple of questions around getting the balance right between what you might call raising the alarm without being alarmist, right? And the degree to which you may risk, going too far on one side and either scaring too many people, driving them away from some of the things that we can do, or desensitizing them to the eventuality that something like this might happen, so that they're less ready and less aware, that they've kind of just assumed it will happen and gotten more complacent, versus not raising the awareness and not raising the alarm enough, and having not the right people, the right people don't know about it. So just maybe talk a little bit about how you look at that. And then for the panelists, what is the right level to get the attention in the kinds of places that you guys play?
Maybe I'll just kick off the response to that with a fairly short answer. One of the things I'm always really mindful of is not inducing a sort of learned helplessness, especially in writing about fairly dystopian or challenging, futures. My being, I'm an optimist, I think in my core, but I like to stare into the abyss because I feel it's incumbent to do this work well. You have to be able to confront those realities. Of course, when the stakes are lowest, when you're creating a fictional scenario, that is the very time to help start to shed light on problems often that people don't want to talk about. This is something even in my old life as a reporter I'd found, whether it was the vulnerability in hacking to US defense systems, whether it was the F-35 program or the video feeds that go up to remotely piloted aircraft. to, even in Ghost Fleet, seeing the sorts of questions that got to be raised about supply chain and hardware vulnerabilities. Not that they weren't discretely important questions in and of themselves, but really understanding what the actual operational implications were, because you could show that. Then you could help galvanize people to tackle a problem that certain communities, let's say within the Defense Department or the technology sector, would know about, but no one had coalesced around let's handle that as a problem. And I think that bad news does not flow upwards very well sometimes, and vulnerabilities and such are certainly in that classification of bad news that it doesn't travel very well.
I would just add in a couple of things. I think the one is that the scare scenarios, the bad stories, they're already all out there. Let's go back to the narrative of the power grid might go down or whatnot. I mean, that's out there, that's swirling, and they've been out there a long time. I think the challenge is a twofold one. The first is they tend to be on the wrong scenarios and discussion. And that is related to the second, which is it means they're FUD because they're not research grounded. So, the subtitle of the book even is an illustration of this. The subtitle is a novel of the real robotic revolution. And think about when we talk about robotics and AI, we've had exactly, it was 1920, 100 years of discussion around the robot's going to revolt and kill us all. That was the very first discussion in the play where robot, the word originates in 1920, and it's continued today. And it's not just a science fiction discourse, it's driven policy discussion in terms of killer robots everywhere from the Pentagon to the United Nations had a debate about it. It's led Silicon Valley billionaires to invest over $5 billion in research and development on the existential threat of robots coming to kill us all. And yet, the issue is not that. The issue is what we've talked about here of living through an industrial revolution. As you rewire the economy, as you rewire our cities, you get all these wonderful advantages, but you also get, all sorts of new vulnerabilities that we're baking in, and we have to think about in a cybersecurity sense too. You get political effects in terms of what it means to live through an industrial revolution. The FUD side is the same. The scenario is often these people kind of, because they're not real, it also means there's nothing that you can do about them, as opposed to when they're real scenarios grounded in real research, there's real things that you can do to prevent them. So that's how we try and go after it. The final thing that I would say is that it also allows you to avoid the 9/11 scenario where the commission report said, it was a failure of imagination. No one could visualize it. Narrative allows you to visualize, put people in that world, and it then impels action. For us, what we found is what we hope we're engaged in is not an act of prediction, but prevention, which is sort of odd to say as novelists, but we hope people look at the scenarios and say, ooh, I don't like that happening. Okay, what can be done? Oh, by the way, here's a footnote about here's the vulnerability that led to it, or we need legislation to close off this element of it.
I would briefly add as well that one of the things that tends to happen in our community that we have to be very careful of, and I see a lot when cybersecurity people first get involved in ICS, is not only the alarmism and grounding in reality. That's absolutely the right way to do it, everything that Peter's walked through. But there's sometimes an arrogance that forms of like, you all are idiots. Before I showed up to point this out to you, how did you live? And the reality is our infrastructure is very reliable, and we have the safest infrastructure in history today. I mean, that's been through a lot of amazing work, a lot of good engineering, a lot of operations, sort of expertise developed. The way you approach the problem is as important as sort of the accuracy of it when you relate to it, whether it's alarmism of FUD, of, hey, you're not an idiot, but the world is changing and as are the threats, so let's design compensating controls. And having sort of that approach of let's partner together on this instead of just pretending that, oh, you have a vulnerability in your PLC. And it's like, yeah, you literally can't turn on the valve though because of these other controls. You get lost in that when it's almost kind of this pecking order effect that takes place.
Yeah, I'd like to add a little bit. I get the Pete hit the nail on the head. Absolutely. When something becomes, sorry for that notification. Um, uh, Responsible education using storytelling or otherwise really comes down to research. And what's great about what Pete and August have put together is it is very well researched. These are fantastic scenarios, but they're realistic and they're based upon grounded research. And it's the same thing with public policy. When you're briefing a policymaker, your credibility is on the line, and you want to say, we've talked with experts who've been doing this for years. Now, I'd like to bring up a different example of how this played out and how that shifted U.S. policymaking. In the late 90s, early 2000s, cyber was a magic hammer, a magic weapon that could do anything and descend from the sky at any time. And that led on the part of U.S. policymakers really to look towards offense. And there was a Dunning-Kruger effect going on, I think, at a senior policymaking level. And that led us to go and invest in a direction that ultimately did not helpful. But as you've had people who've been experienced and more educated in public policy, more technically familiar, if not technically proficient, understanding what the realities of the technology are, you're starting to see a shift in public policy and in military strategy around cyber. I think the really thing we're trying to avoid is we do not want a security dilemma to result because of us shadow boxing with something that's unrealistic. And that's really what we're trying to avoid. That's what it means to be in public policy making, to be responsible, and any narratives that ensure that we're not shadow boxing with an unrealistic scenario, I think is the appropriate one.
Yeah, and when you start talking about too, like the art of the possible, so not looking at adversary scenarios that could never happen, but taking it down from the federal level down to the state and local, and some of the folks who are having to deal with these issues, but the gaming, the tabletop exercises, the discussions, and bringing to light, as particularly in this book, different things that could happen. It helps them, it permits the problem solving, it helps them get outside of where they've been told, where they've read, seen. It permits seeing the blind spots, and you think, oh, well, if that happened, then I would do this, this, and this. Like, this would never hamper me or do things because we have this. Well, what happens if that? It allows them to go through that process that perhaps they wouldn't have thought of it but for Hollywood or other creatives kind of highlighting this in a way other than the more academic setting of, well, you're an idiot, you haven't done this. But it takes away some of the stigma and allows it to be a creative process that becomes key when you're in the middle of a crisis and the playbook just had to go out the window.
All right, next question. It says, great book, would make a great movie. I assume you guys paid for that review. Anything underway for Burn-In or Ghost Fleet to go to Hollywood?
There is, I don't know how you want to answer that, Pete. Yeah, they both would make, we write very visually, and I'd like to think that, when people are reading, they can see the movie playing before their eyes, right? That's how I like to kind of imagine scenes. And so on Ghost Fleet, we have a interest in that, and then we'll see where Burn-In takes us.
August's op security is fantastic, isn't it? We're certainly hopeful. We'll see what happens. But yeah, there's been the rights to Ghost Fleet have been bought, but not for movie because of issues related that are the same issues that relate to having an open discussion about supply chain security and intellectual property theft. But on Burn-In, it domestically set opens up a lot more.
Got a question for the panelists this time. What is one cybersecurity issue you wish garnered more attention from legislators and policymakers?
All right. So I'll say that we are a culture on, and I'm speaking only on the infrastructure side, but specifically industrial, we tend to have a culture of regulation, and it seems to be that regulation is almost always the answer for everything, but you can't regulate security. It can be a tool to leverage, but we too often see, we'll go make a secure gas pipeline. Like, well, what do you want us to do? Well, I want you to have passwords. Like, well, that might be out of date in 2 years. And so we're very prescriptive in our regulation as well. So I'd like to see better performance-based regulation of here's what we want you to do as an infrastructure provider. Here's things that if you get notified of an incident, you have to be able to scope it within 24 hours, regardless of how you do it. Or you don't need to install anti-malware. You need to have an anti-malware program associated with your offering. So as it relates to regulations, I'd prefer to see much more performance-based, but from a policy standpoint of it, I would like to see a lot more incentives. A lot of our infrastructure owners and operators do a tremendous job, and oftentimes in complying with just the regulation, they'll try to do things above the regulation and have to unroll them because of the regulation. We should be incentivizing those companies to go above regulation, and in doing so, feel safe in the choices they're making. Also, just speaking sort of from the homogenous aspect, we don't want everyone, like the electric power environment, to be, here's the standard for NERC-CIT. If you follow this, you're good. So all you're saying to an adversary is, well, this is literally all the things that they're doing, almost one for one across utilities. So I'm seeing some of that. I'm seeing some of it for like cooperatives and munis and smaller infrastructure sites, but I would like to see a lot more around how to incentivize security adoption across to Elizabeth's points, more state and federal and local, state and local side of the house.
Sorry, I couldn't get the unmute fast enough. And building on that, really when it comes to unmanned systems being the best, as well as all of the stuff this week focusing on, or all the news focusing on facial recognition, go drill down, continue to take that deeper look of what are you actually trying to prohibit, prevent, regulate, because if you focus on the technology itself, then you're forever chasing. So drones are bad. Well, what do you mean? Is it the privacy issues? Is it the safety issues of how do these communicate? So rather than focusing on a specific technology or a specific thing, digging deeper, because as Rob pointed out, I mean, as stuff is evolving and the technology becomes outdated, if you focus too much on that, facial recognition is bad. Well, there are times where facial authentication can be used and can be helpful in really kind of framing how we're looking at the questions from, again, a policy and a regulatory level. I think will really be a game changer.
I'll keep I know we're running on time, so I'll keep my comments brief. I won't talk about what I originally intended, which was a frank discussion on supply chain and the distortions of what should be ostensibly a free market globally. But focus on something a little bit different, a little bit more bureaucratic. I think we need to have, I really do think, and this is something I think we talked about in the commission and was a sticky situation, is really what is the appropriate role of government in cybersecurity and private critical infrastructure? What can it do to have the greatest impact? I mean, I think we need to recognize that we have a thriving cybersecurity industry that does a very, very good job, and it operates on a expanding information economy that is the fuel for a lot of that cybersecurity work, and the government's sort of view into that economy is shrinking relative to its growing size. So the question is what is that role? And to say nothing of the fact that the technological substrata that operates where cybersecurity exists and needs to be empowered is operated by the private sector as well. The private sector makes the vast majority of decisions on in the cyber ecosystem and has more power and has more flexibility than the government does. And this is an incredibly strange dynamic that an entire realm of human behavior, economy, and industry exists virtually that the government has such little control over. That is a very, very new dynamic. I don't think we've arrived or really decided on what the social contract is that exists there, what's the appropriate governance model, or the best role government can play in either helping out and securing it, or empowering the thriving private sector actors that already exist. I know that is a very, very high level thing, but that is something that I think ultimately the commission and I think public policy professionals are really struggling to answer and define. And I think that that conversation will be decided in the next few decades, one way or the other.
All right, and as you alluded to, that's just about all the time we've got. August, Pete, I don't know if you guys had any last thoughts in the last 30 to 60 seconds here.
Well, this is a great opportunity, Bo, to connect with everyone. Thank you to the panelists, to the audience for giving us your lunch hour. If you're interested in reading Burn-In, you can, of course, find it at your usual spots. It's available online, places like Amazon, your local bookstore can get it for you. And if you're interested in buying it that way, indiebound.org or bookshop.org can help you with that. And of course, there's an audio and an ebook version out there too.
I just want to add in my thanks as well, and our hope that this project proves to be useful fiction. The combination of has utility to people working on these real issues and trying to communicate them, but also is just entertaining and enjoyable for people. So thank you again, and especially to you, Bo, and the fellow panelists for helping us to speak about it and spread the word.
All right. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.